Professor Robert Mundell, winner of the Nobel Prize for Economics, did the pioneering study on the euro that led ultimately to the introduction of the Eurozone. He's a distinguished speaker at the Asian Financial Forum in January 2011 in Hong Kong. So, Professor Mundell, thanks indeed for joining us here in Hong Kong. Now, one of the big issues at the moment is whether there's going to be a currency war, chiefly between the United States and China, with the US really demanding that China appreciates its currency, whereas the rest of the world looks at the US dollar, which is at the moment sinking. So what do you think? Do you think there will be a currency war?
A currency war is just a shorthand expression for referring to a problem connected with the currencies. There's not going to be a war. A real currency war would mean that China is trying to fix the exchange rate with the dollar at one level, and the United States started to intervene in the foreign exchange market at another level. That would be a real war, and that would be, but that war would be so horrible that nobody would do it long before that takes place. They'd have backed away from it because it wouldn't be a terrible thing for the international monetary system.
So what should the US be doing really to balance its trade with China?
Well, there's no direct way the country can, like the United States, it doesn't intervene much in the foreign exchange market or in any market can fix the bilateral balances. There's no reason why bilateral trade needs to be balanced. As long as the United States and China are trading, the U.S. is probably going to have a deficit with China and China will have ultimately a surplus with the United States and a deficit with some other countries. It's overall balance that's really the fundamental thing. But it's easy, of course, for the United States because they have both China has an overall surplus and the U.S. has an overall deficit, so you can work on the Chinese side, and that's why the focus is on the RMB rather than otherwise. But if you think of the U.S. with a deficit that it's had of something like $800–700 billion over most of this period in the past that it had this deficit, the Chinese element of that deficit was about a quarter or maybe a third of it, and maybe it could even be getting up at some point to close to 40% of that deficit, but it's only part of it.
And looking at it from the China point of view, do you think the Chinese government are taking the right track here, really allowing the renminbi to appreciate a little bit, but not too much?
It's hard to say in a way because I think inside China there's not a complete unity of opinion inside China, just as in the Western democracies. There are divisions of opinion between, sometimes in the US, between the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, or between the Treasury and the State Department. I'm not among those people who think that China needs to change its exchange rate. That's only, you can have perfect balance between countries with fixed exchange rates. For example, Hong Kong has had a fixed exchange rate with the dollar since 1983 with its currency board system. It doesn't have any problems with it because it brings its accounts into balance and it allows its monetary policy to bring about equilibrium. But China doesn't have a strict currency board system like the United States. There's no automatic adjustment system that's going on in China. It's discretionary. Chinese authorities know that they have to, in the long run, increase total consumption in China.
And talking about the Hong Kong dollar, because you mentioned that before, some people see that as being between a rock and a hard place. On the one side, the US dollar is beginning to weaken, and the Hong Kong dollar is pegged against the US dollar, whilst the renminbi is strengthening. So do you think that really the Hong Kong dollar should be in a basket of currencies against the renminbi, the yen perhaps, as well as the US dollar?
That would really invite a lot of instability for Hong Kong and its policy. The dollar peg has served very, very well since 1983. There are two cases where Hong Kong might want to consider changing its exchange rate. One was that if there's any demonstration of real instability in the United States, monetary instability in the United States, but there's no indication of that because inflation rate in the United States is 2% or less. There's no inflation in the United States at all. Some people think there's even deflation. Now there could be in the future because the asset position of the banking system looks as if there's a potential for more inflation, but that doesn't exist at the present time. And the second case would be if China itself, mainland China itself, moved toward complete convertibility. in which case there wouldn't be any problem for Hong Kong whether it fixed to the dollar or to the RMB. It could consider that. If the mainland currency became convertible, then China could consider a change. But I wouldn't recommend that because at the present time, the peg to the dollar has stood Hong Kong in very good stead. And you don't know, you can never say, should you go off that peg without saying, where are you going to go to?
So, Professor Mundell, would you ever see in the future a fully convertible renminbi?
Well, I think it's a little bit like it'll go along with political reform, because the issue is whether a country's policy, whether it's best for the very large reserves of China to be managed by the centrally or to be distributed among the population. In terms of welfare, it may be better to have it distributed and have a completely free system. But in terms of power, the great concentration of reserves in one country under the control of the government gives it more power than it would have otherwise.
Professor Mundell, looking rather more broadly at your work in optimum currency areas, which gave rise to the euro, the Eurozone itself is looking under threat because of the sovereign debt crisis. But do you think that it's really time to look back, to revisit, if you like, the whole business of these optimum currency areas?
My criterion for optimum currency areas was related to really labor mobility, factor mobility. The areas of factor mobility make better currency areas than otherwise. The assumption implicit in all this is that each country maintains fiscal integrity and fiscal balance. The problem in Europe that's arisen and in the Eurozone is not strictly a Euro problem, it's a fiscal problem of a few countries, typically poorer countries in the south of Europe, that entered the Eurozone, and because they gave up their currencies and share a common currency, they can, if they have an expanding government spending and even budget deficits, there's no threat of devaluation. So that removed a barrier to budget deficits, and that created a fiscal weakness. So I think there was a lack of emphasis, stress on the seriousness of the problem, of the importance of budget balance for countries. Now, you have now a problem in there where it may be in the future quite possible that one of the countries, one or two or three of those countries might have to have some kind of restructuring. Or instead of bankruptcy, they have some kind of restructuring. But I think that'll all take place within the context of the euro itself as it is, because there's no feasible way any of those countries leaving the Eurozone would make them better off. It would be a disaster for them.
And given the question of optimum currencies, would you see those conditions arising here in Asia?
The free trade zone between ASEAN and China is inevitably going to make a kind of the Chinese yuan be a very important dominant regional currency here. Whether or not Asia itself could come into the framework of an Asian currency area with an Asian currency would depend very much on, at least in the immediate future, on relations between China and Japan. And I think the two big currencies in Asia, right now, the way I see it is more likely that rather than an area that includes both, I see the Chinese currency in Asia expanding and becoming a regional, sub-regional area currency in this area, rather than integration of all of Asia.
So you'd see the renminbi really linking up with other currencies, forming a monetary union?
Well, remember, you have to, in spite of the RMB, the RMB is almost de facto convertible in many ways. You see, one of the global currency, the theoretical currency in the world is the SDR, the special drawing rights of the IMF, which is a basket right now of four of the major currencies. There are the dollar, euro, the pound sterling, and the Japanese yen. China has not been in this, and China should be put in this. I agree that even though the Chinese currency is inconvertible, or not completely convertible, that because of its great strength and because of the fact it's the biggest exporter in the world and number two power in the world by country, you can't exclude China's currency from this. So it should be put into this with and along with the other 4 currencies. You have a 5-currency basket, and then it doesn't have to have a large weight in the basket the first time. Every 5 years they have a review of these. They're making their next review. It has to be by 2011. So they have to finish it up this year. And I myself think that China should have at least, for a starting point, a 10% weight in the basket, and then that would be more doubled, or even more than that doubled in the next 5 years after that. So I think that shows that the RMB is on its way to being one of the top currencies in the world. Maybe the dollar, euro, and the RMB will displace at the moment the yen and the pound sterling in the long run because of the great growth of China relative to those other countries.
Professor Mundell, you're attending the Asian Financial Forum 2011 in January. What are the real big discussion points that you're going to be hearing there? Are they going to be the same as we've been discussing now?
Well, I guess some of the issues we've been discussing, the role of the RMB in Asia, the possibility of an Asian currency area, whether a lot of people think it's possible. I once thought it would be worth considering and to doing, but I found the political elements may make it difficult to achieve. And of course the exchange rate, the dollar US, the RMB dollar exchange rate, that'll be an issue that'll certainly can't avoid it.